In the summer of 1944, beneath a sky washed pale by heat, a newly captured German corporal named Hans Meisner stepped off a freight train onto a siding in central Texas. He expected barbed wire, guards with rifles raised, and perhaps hunger. Instead, the air smelled of cut hay and roasted meat. Across the dusty road stood a low wooden gate marked only Camp Hearn. Behind it, rows of neat white barracks lined an expanse of trimmed grass. "They told us we were prisoners," he later wrote in his diary, "but nothing looked like prison." That first impression, so disorienting to men arriving from the wreckage of Europe, frames an enduring question. What happens when an enemy soldier meets abundance, and that abundance begins to reshape the idea of war itself? By that point, the Allied front was pushing through Normandy, and the tide of World War II had turned decisively. Thousands of Axis troops were surrendering in North Africa, Italy, and France. The United States Army, suddenly responsible for more than 400,000 German prisoners of war, faced a vast logistical challenge. Most captives were shipped far from combat zones, scattered across more than 500 camp complexes spanning from Arizona to Pennsylvania. The Geneva Conventions obligated humane treatment, and Washington recognized a second, subtler aim. Well-treated prisoners might later carry home stories that undercut Nazi propaganda about Allied cruelty. The War Department's own memorandum from February 1944 phrased it plainly: "Discipline through decency shall be our method." The camps themselves often mirrored small American towns. Built with prefabricated lumber, each enclosure held barracks, mess halls, recreation yards, and even theaters. Life within that orderliness astonished men who, only months before, had fought amid desert dust or Russian snow. Rumors circulated among captives while they still waited in European ports. The Americans fed prisoners meat 3 times a week, allowed them Protestant or Catholic chaplains, and sometimes offered English lessons. A few dismissed such claims as fantasy. After all, their own rations at the front had dwindled to dry bread and ersatz coffee. Hans Meisner had been 19 when drafted into the Wehrmacht 2 years earlier. His hometown near Leipzig once produced soap and bicycles, but by 1944 had sunk into shortages and air raid alerts. His mother's letters, censored and delayed, described trading wedding rings for flour. In Italy, where he was captured after the fall of Monte Cassino, the army ration was reduced to whatever could fit in a single tin. Emerging from that deprivation into an American camp with functioning kitchens was to live a contradiction. Another figure whose memory casts light on those months was Lieutenant Karl Weber, a schoolteacher from Bremen before the war. Slightly older, cautious in tone, Weber recorded his first evening in captivity as a night without fear for the first time in years. His notebook from 1945, preserved in a regional archive, paraphrases a line spoken by a fellow inmate: "In America, even our guards eat like generals." For both men, this new existence demanded recalibration between gratitude, suspicion, and the long reach of ideology that still defined their uniforms. The political context surrounding their arrival was complex. Domestically, the United States was balancing war production, rationing, and an expanding workforce now reliant on women and migrant laborers. Agricultural output lagged behind demand, and local governments seized the opportunity to lease POW labor to farms and factories. Under Army regulation, captives could volunteer for paid work, credits, not cash, hoeing cotton, cutting timber, or canning vegetables. The pay was small but symbolic, proof of normalcy. In the heat of Kansas, some prisoners learned how American crops were irrigated by machines rather than by hand. Others marveled at the punctual meals served at noon: real beef, potatoes, even butter. Observers from the International Committee of the Red Cross made regular inspections. Their reports, later released, read like travelogues between two moral universes. On one side, the bomb-scarred towns of Europe, on the other, the quiet order of Midwestern camps. A note from an ICRC delegate in December 1943 described Camp Swift in Texas as clean, well-organized, and supremely ordinary, the only strangeness being that the soldiers speak German. Within that ordinariness, paradoxes multiplied. Prisoners wrote home through censored postcards expressing both relief and confusion. One, preserved in the Bundesarchive, bears Meissner's hand writing, "We eat better here than our families do there. I cannot understand the logic, only that I feel guilty when the plates are cleared." The camp canteens sold small luxuries unobtainable in wartime Germany, chocolate, cigarettes, even Coca Cola, bottled under government contract. For men whose rations at the front had once included horse meat, such products seemed absurd, almost theatrical. In a December 1944 letter, Weber mentioned his first taste of ice cream. "The texture is like snow sweetened by civilization itself." The phrase hints at wonder, wrapped in irony, a recognition that while Europe starved, its sons found sugar on foreign soil. American authorities debated how much comfort was appropriate. Strict national rationing remained in effect. Citizens relied on coupons for meat and sugar. Yet within the wire, the same ingredients appeared in remarkable abundance. Local newspapers occasionally objected. An editorial in an Iowa daily complained in 1945, "Our boys fight on black coffee while the Germans spoon up dessert." The War Department responded that the rations met international obligations and helped maintain discipline. It was a pragmatic defense cloaked in moral terms. Beyond nourishment came recreation. Many camps equipped modest libraries, stocked with both German classics and censored world literature. Prisoners watched Hollywood newsreels projected onto makeshift screens. Clark Gable and Rita Hayworth flickered across the walls of captivity. Bands formed, choirs rehearsed sacred music, and chess tournaments filled the empty afternoons. Such activities were intended to occupy time and minimize unrest, but they also suggested a wider phenomenon. Culture had survived the Atlantic crossing. For both Meissner and Weber, these experiences triggered reflection rather than relief. Meissner wrote of feeling ashamed at ease, and Weber began to translate American poems to teach himself English. Their correspondence shows ambivalence, gratitude tinged with disbelief, as if the abundance itself were propaganda. And in some respects, it was. Information officers distributed pamphlets extolling democratic life, setting up lectures on civics and post-war humanity. Few prisoners attended willingly at first, yet curiosity grew in proportion to boredom. Outside the fences, the US population rarely saw these men. Most camps lay on the edges of small towns where the only interaction came through work details or Sunday church invitations. Accounts from residents reveal the same astonishment mirrored in reverse. Polite, blonde farmhands who said "please" in thick accents. Some farmers later admitted that the German laborers saved entire harvests. For local children, the prisoners' carving of toys from scrap wood left memories less of enemies than of strangers with strange stories. Still, the moral dissonance persisted. Reports from Europe described Allied bombings of Hamburg or Cologne, cities flattened into ash. Mail from families arrived weeks late, each envelope a compressed ache. Inside the camps, with jukeboxes humming in nearby towns, that distance became psychological terrain. As one prisoner summarized to a visiting chaplain in early 1945, "We are safe in America, and that safety burns." Throughout 1945, as Germany's defeat approached, interrogators and morale officers observed shifts among the captives. Early on, many still believed in eventual victory. Later, they listened to shortwave news in silence. Some camps hosted controlled radio broadcasts replaying reports from the front. The tone changed from martial optimism to disbelief and grief. The question moved inward, from "will we win?" to "what will become of us when we return?" Meanwhile, American guards, often themselves young men spared front-line duty, developed uneasy respect for their charges. Diaries of U.S. sergeants frequently note surprises, the discipline of the prisoners, their craftsmanship, their politeness. One guard at Camp Atterbury wrote in May 1945, paraphrased from his entry, "They build furniture from scrap wood and ask for varnish. Maybe making something clean is their way to feel free." Strict boundaries remained, but the edges of enmity softened under shared routines of laundry, mail calls, and payday lines. As winter turned to spring, global news filtered in: the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, the revelation of concentration camps. The prisoners were stunned. Few had believed the scale of such crimes until the photographs appeared. Guards pinned newspapers to bulletin boards by official order. For men like Karl Weber, a lifelong teacher, the images of emaciated survivors at Buchenwald fractured any lingering illusions about honor or obedience. "No victory can cleanse that," he muttered, according to a guard's recollection. From that point, the moral texture of captivity changed. The contrast between privation in Europe and subsistence in America grew painfully vivid when news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the camps in May 1945. Celebrations erupted outside the fences. Inside, quiet disbelief reigned. The prisoners' world, built on discipline and defeat, suspended itself between relief and loss. Many feared reprisals on return, others clung to the hope that what they had glimpsed, the calm, the fairness, even the taste of ice cream, might somehow survive beyond captivity. Red Cross representatives soon began classifying prisoners for repatriation. Yet transportation was slow. Thousands remained in U.S. custody through 1946 and even 1947. In those long months, the rhythm of abundance continued, if tempered by uncertainty. For Meissner and Weber, the camp became less an enclosure than a mirror reflecting two societies, one destroyed by war, another powered by industrial plenty. Smaller privileges, a radio tuned to swing music, a newspaper in translation, the simple act of reading by electric light, took on symbolic weight. In time, some prisoners wrote essays for camp journals pondering moral responsibility, democracy, and everyday civility. A recurring phrase appeared: "Freedom is not the same as fullness." They understood that the candy bars and Coca Cola bottles, delightful as they seemed, were not the essence of American life, but its surface. Beneath lay contradictions, racial segregation, domestic shortages, and propaganda of its own kind. Yet, compared to the Europe they remembered, even contradictions felt humane. As 1946 turned, the camps gradually thinned. Repatriation ships waited in eastern ports. Meissner's last diary note before departure reflected conflicted gratitude. "They gave us books and bread. I will return with both heavier than when I arrived." Left behind were empty barracks, soon converted for displaced persons or new labor programs. The era of German prisoners in America had been brief, yet its paradox lingered. An island of wartime comfort floating amid global catastrophe. What began for Hans Meissner and Karl Weber as bewildering captivity slowly opened into reflection about the meaning of decency in defeat. Their story, shared by many of the 400,000 men who tasted American abundance, invites a deeper look at how nations choose to treat their enemies and how those choices reverberate long after weapons fall silent. And as the ships prepared to carry them home, the question still hung in the warm Atlantic wind. What memory would they preserve, the sting of loss or the sweetness of the ice cream served behind the wire? It is from that uncertain horizon that the next phase of their journey would unfold. By the end of 1944, Hans Meissner had settled into the strange rhythm of captivity. The camp calendar, once alien, now measured his seasons. Each morning began with roll call under the Texas sun, followed by the hum of work details heading beyond the wire. The local landscape, flat grasslands marked by mesquite and the distant shimmer of heat, became its own kind of frontier, stripped of fear but heavy with dull monotony. To a young man whose past year had meant orders, bombings and hunger, that monotony took on the texture of calm, even a muted grace. He volunteered for a work crew that harvested cotton under contract between the army and nearby farmers. The conditions could be brutal: no shade, temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, insects rising from soil. Yet the men were paid a few cents per hour, convertible into camp tokens, and could spend them on small luxuries: razors, candy, notebooks. "I like the weight of coins again," Meissner noted in his pocket diary around September 1944, paraphrasing a sentiment later quoted in an oral history project. "It reminds me that I belong to a world of people, not trenches." For him, the fields were both workplace and stage, bordered by white fences rather than machine gun nests. In contrast, Lieutenant Karl Weber remained closer to camp administration, assigned as an interpreter in the education section. His English, self-taught from books, made him a mediator between US officers and German prisoners. The ideological war still echoed faintly through his duties. In one report from early 1945, he translated for a political re-education lecture titled "The Meaning of Democratic Citizenship." Afterward, he wrote privately, "Some listen, some laugh. I sit between worlds, not knowing whether to clap or stay silent." Weber's position placed him at the boundary between two realities: the disciplined routines of POW life and the distant moral skies of a collapsing Reich. Through the winter of 1944 into 1945, changes in the larger war filtered slowly through radio and rumor. Prisoners followed the Battle of the Bulge on noticeboard maps drawn in pencil, marking towns whose names blurred into foreign phonetics. Each reversal, each Allied advance, altered moods inside the camps in subtle waves. The US military broadcast short programs in German through the Prisoner of War Information Service, designed to inform and influence. One paraphrased quote from a December 1944 broadcast declared, "Your families are hungry, your leaders hide in bunkers, your surrender does not mean betrayal, but survival." The message landed uneasily, half comfort, half rebuke. The physical environment played its own role in shaping their understanding of defeat. American camps were built for efficiency, their utilities powered by reliable water pumps and electric grids immune to blackouts. After months of Allied bombing in Europe, these simple continuities appeared miraculous. Even storms carried unfamiliar gentleness. When heavy spring rain swept across the barracks' roofs, prisoners stood at windows watching, astonished that floodlights burned steadily through the night. Meissner described one such scene in a 1945 entry. "The thunder rolled, but nothing exploded." Food remained the most tangible symbol of contrast. By regulation, German POWs received rations equivalent to US troops not deployed in combat, roughly 3,600 calories daily. Men who had starved on the Eastern Front now joked that America planned to feed us into surrender. The army cooks improvised with whatever came from depots: white bread, beans, tinned fruit. Occasional shortages occurred, but seldom hunger. Guards sometimes shared coffee with prisoners. In turn, prisoners taught them how to brew proper European chicory blends. That exchange, trivial in itself, eroded boundaries more effectively than directives or lectures. Despite abundance, psychological tension lingered. Some prisoners clung to Nazi loyalty, organizing clandestine order groups that policed fellow inmates who expressed gratitude toward guards or questioned Hitler. In several camps, including Herne and Fort Devens, this simmering conflict led to intimidation and, on rare occasions, violence. Weber, as interpreter, witnessed the aftermath of an internal beating in early 1945. He noted in his journal, They fear freedom more than chains, for freedom asks what they cannot answer. American officers slowly dismantled these groups through transfers and segregation, separating hardliners from moderates. For Meissner, the turning point came during Christmas 1944. The camp chaplain arranged a midday service, complete with a small pine tree brought in from a nearby ranch. Prisoners sang Stille Nacht, their voices echoing off sheet metal walls. At the end, guards distributed Red Cross parcels containing biscuits, jam, and, for holiday surprise, a chilled bottle of Coca Cola every 2 men. Meissner remembered that taste for the rest of his life, cold sweetness balanced against memory's bitterness. "I thought of my mother walking to the bakery to trade her coat for bread," he told an interviewer in 1968. "I could not swallow without shame." The American authorities framed such gestures with incalculated leniency. Camp policy emphasized reciprocity. The better the treatment of German POWs, the greater leverage to safeguard American prisoners in Europe. Supply chains closed this loop. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps distributed standardized Type A menus. Railways carried flour, meat, and coffee to depots servicing both soldiers and POW camps. Climate kept stores stable. The arid air of the Southwest preserved everything except fresh milk, which vendors supplied locally. The logistics themselves revealed a nation at technological maturity, assembly line efficiency, delivering even to those who had fought against it. When the European war's end approached in the spring of 1945, new uncertainties emerged. News of German cities reduced to ruins reached the camps through official bulletins and letters. At first, censors removed descriptions of devastation. Later, with surrender imminent, restrictions loosened. In April, Weber received a battered envelope bearing his brother's handwriting. "Bremen is gone. Father says there is no school, no shop window, no glass left anywhere." He read the line aloud in silence. For him, abundance within the wire had become its own captivity, too much comfort to reconcile with the wasteland at home. Several camps introduced discussion groups for democratic reconstruction, inviting prisoners to analyze press clippings or debate post-war responsibility. Attendance varied. Meissner joined partly for access to English newspapers. Reading about the Nuremberg planning conferences, he underlined a headline, "Peace must be learned as purpose." Beneath it, he scribbled, "Maybe that is why they feed us." Learning English expanded not only vocabulary but perspective, translating the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He paused at the second word, unsure which German term fit. Freiheit carried historical weight now poisoned by misuse. Spring also brought a sensory bloom alien to European front memories. Bluebonnets blanketed the Texas fields beyond the fence. Older prisoners took up sketching or photography under guard supervision. Some captured the horizon's radiance through barbed wire silhouettes. The images survive in family albums donated decades later. Sunlight caught in contradiction, enemy art framed by freedom. Technological shifts deepened that paradox. Every camp maintained a radio link to surrounding towns, playing the same dance tunes soldiers might hear on leave. Loudspeakers transmitted Allied news in measured tones, part of ongoing re-education. Hearing swing music or Roosevelt speeches, prisoners were thrust into a sonic modernity they had been taught to despise. Yet familiarity bred transformation. Weber observed in a 1945 entry, "The rhythm is foreign and alive. Perhaps the future sounds like this." As days passed uneventfully, captives redirected energy toward creation. Workshops fashioned intricate furniture, violins, model ships. Camp libraries added translations of Mark Twain and Dickens, prompting discussions that spilled across bunks late at night. For young men starved of choice, these artifacts became quiet instruments of self-reconstruction. Technical manuals, plumbing, electrical repair, agriculture were in constant demand. American officers viewed it as preparation for Europe's rebuilding, prisoners sensed it as passage from destruction to renewal. The climate again shaped existence at extremes. Summer 1945 brought heat so intense guards relaxed uniform codes, allowing bare heads and open collars. At dusk, the camp buzzed with cicadas, flushed skies, stained fences copper. Meissner wrote, "Something inside me melts like the tar on the road." I am less German, perhaps, or more human, yet that same heat fostered restlessness. With the war officially over in May, every sunrise without transport home tested patience. Men argued, despaired, retreated to day-long card games. Rumours of transfers to Britain or France spread, many true. European allies sought labour to rebuild shattered infrastructure. For Weber, purpose arrived in translation. The army invited literate prisoners to assist in converting technical manuals for occupation forces in Germany. Surrounded by typewriters and carbon paper, he laboured in a converted barracks where ceiling fans murmured perpetually. "It is strange," he scribbled, near August 1945, "to rebuild with words before our hands are allowed to rebuild with tools." When fatigue struck, he stepped outside, studying clouds that drifted eastward, perhaps toward home. Even abundance had limits. Shortages hit America in late 1945 as the war's supply networks contracted. Coffee rations halved, sugar shipments delayed, yet the camps retained privileges most civilians envied. Newspaper articles described citizens queuing for gasoline while POW trucks rolled freely to farms. Resentment re-emerged. In response, the War Department publicized prisoner labor statistics. By official counts, POWs contributed over 5 million man-days to U.S. agriculture, offsetting labor shortages and keeping food stores stable. That rationale quieted some critics but reminded prisoners of their ambiguous status, neither enemy nor employee, serving an economy that both fed and confined them. Inside, cultural life continued to evolve. In Camp Hern's theatre hall, prisoners staged Faust in German before an audience of guards and locals. The performance, July 1946, symbolized reconciliation in miniature. Meissner played the scholar who seeks knowledge beyond constraint. At the curtain's fall, applause filled the hall, a convergence of two languages briefly unarmed. For many, the play marked farewell. Transport orders soon followed, listing ports of embarkation: Norfolk, Newport News, New York. Amid farewell weeks, Weber collected fragments: a bent spoon, an English dictionary, a small sketch of the central watchtower. He intended to keep them as proof that gentleness can survive war. His notebooks end shortly after that line. Records show he was repatriated in October 1946, routed through Le Havre. Meissner embarked earlier, in July. Both men sailed past Statue of Liberty silhouettes, gazing not as tourists but as witnesses to contradictions that would shadow them across decades. For the journey home, the army supplied standard kits: wool uniforms without insignia, tinned coffee, and cigarettes labelled Victory Blend. The voyage lasted 9 days, long enough for the ocean to erase habits of captivity. Yet abundance had altered them too deeply to disappear. Each time Meissner saw a chocolate bar in ship rations, guilt surfaced like a tide. "How will we explain this to those who buried children?" he asked Weber, according to a fellow passenger's recollection. There was no answer, only horizon and wind. When disembarkation finally came, the difference in air was almost physical. Europe smelled of coal smoke and disinfectant. Trains carried returnees through towns still gutted by bombing. Roofs gaped, windows hung empty. Relatives waited with uncertainty rather than joy. Some whispered that prisoners from America were spoiled, softened by Western luxury. Meissner faced the accusation in local debriefings. "You were fed cake while we hid in shelters." He tried to describe the contradiction, the taste of plenty mixed with exile, but words failed. Back in Bremen, Weber witnessed the transformation of thought that his camp mentors had preached. Eager to resume teaching, he used his grasp of English to translate pamphlets for municipal rebuilding projects. Later, he admitted that what he carried from captivity was not ideology but courtesy. "They made us stand in line, but they never starved us," he told a student in 1952. That difference explains more of civilization than any manifesto. Despite post-war austerity, memories of abundance persisted among thousands of former POWs. Some kept contact with American guards, trading Christmas cards for years. A few emigrated permanently, drawn by recollections of music and stability. Others repressed those memories, fearing suspicion in a nation split between gratitude and resentment. In academic circles, historians would later debate whether American leniency hastened post-war reconciliation or merely masked economic pragmatism. For men who lived it, such analyses could not capture the quiet collision between decency and defeat. The physical geography that had framed their captivity, the flat plains, the predictable weather, the efficiently supplied kitchens, had also formed a psychological landscape. Within that order, they learned the contours of a peace no army could command. Each guard tower, instead of menace, became a compass point in a new moral map. Though neither Meissner nor Weber could articulate it fully at the time, the experience taught them a paradoxical lesson. Freedom can begin even inside fences when cruelty ends at the gate. As the last transports left America and silence fell over dismantled camps, the legacy of those years remained suspended between memory and interpretation. The next chapters of their lives would unfold amid countries learning to rebuild, confronting guilt, and defining humanity anew. Yet for both men, the taste of that unlikely safety, the cool sweetness of a Coca Cola under the vast American sky, lingered as a measure against every deprivation that followed, a reminder that even in captivity, the image of another way of living had taken root. And it was from that seed of contrast, lodged quietly in returning soldiers' minds, that the post-war reckoning would soon begin. When the war's pages finally settled into ink and archive, those months of captivity stood as a minor footnote in the colossal record of World War II, a quiet counterpoint to the roar of battles. Yet its consequences, though soft-spoken, extended far beyond the fences themselves. Between 1943 and 1946, roughly 425,000 German prisoners of war passed through American custody. Most returned alive, fed, and unharmed, a rarity in a conflict that had erased entire divisions elsewhere. Death rates in US camps were comparatively minimal. Official records cite fewer than 2,000 fatalities, mainly from accidents or illness. By contrast, on the Eastern Front, German POW mortality reached staggering proportions, some estimates exceeding 30%. These numerical contrasts formed ethical maps of their own, drawn not by generals, but by cooks, guards, and bureaucrats whose decisions defined daily bread. The physical camps gradually vanished, their timbers transplanted into post-war housing projects or sold for scrap. What endured were memories that diffused across two continents. For Americans, the sight of former enemies picking cotton or building roads became a passing curiosity. For the prisoners, it was a turning mirror. Letters archived in Bremen and Leipzig reveal recurring phrases: fairness, discipline through reason, no hatred. One paraphrased note from Karl Weber to his wife in early 1947 reads, "They watched us, but they did not despise us. That difference may rebuild us faster than bricks." Militarily, the program's efficiency impressed planners. The US Army managed a network of more than 900 installations with limited unrest, proving that humane containment was not a contradiction in wartime logistics. Technologically, the same supply systems that fueled the front lines could sustain captured enemies without collapse. In strategic hindsight, the decision preserved America's image and reaped long-term dividends. When Germany rebuilt under Allied supervision, Thousands of returning soldiers who had labored and learned in the camps carried fragments of the experience back into civil life. That influence, difficult to measure yet visible in recollections and community records, helped seed the early soil of West Germany's civic reconstruction. The ethical dimension deepens beyond efficiency. Treating defeated soldiers with decency was, in part, a calculated gesture meant to uphold international law and reciprocal protection. But it also revealed a tension between principle and propaganda. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, yet American officials also understood these camps as instruments of psychological warfare, vehicles for re-education through comfort. Was that generosity or manipulation? The answer lies somewhere between. The prisoners' daily encounter with stable meals, working cameras, and functioning governance conveyed a message sharper than any leaflet. Order born of consent, not coercion, produces prosperity. To men reared under dictatorship, this realization registered slowly but lastingly. Still, interpretation must yield first to evidence. The diaries of Hans Meisner, arranged decades later by his daughter, show no explicit political conversion. His entries speak instead of texture and taste, the sweetness of canned peaches, the hum of electric fans, the silence of nights unbroken by bombs. Facts record sustenance, meaning arises in how they echo. "Maybe mercy is learned through meat and sugar," he wrote once, uncertain whether the thought was confession or blasphemy. Such naive observations, repeated across hundreds of journals, transformed into the moral subtext of the post-war encounter. Politically, the POW experiment softened transatlantic narratives. By the early 1950s, as Cold War alliances crystallized, former prisoners who had once worn field gray became interpreters, translators, even civic leaders advocating cooperation with their former captors. Scholars later debated whether gratitude or necessity drove this reconciliation. Either way, the chain of cause and effect leads partly through those kitchens and classrooms behind American fences. When the Marshall Plan unfolded, many Germans recalled the efficiency and security witnessed in captivity. Reconstruction thus drew, however subtly, from an unlikely education in democracy delivered through full plates and library cards. Yet moral clarity remains incomplete. To acknowledge humane treatment of German soldiers is not to diminish atrocities perpetrated by their regime. History must hold both truths simultaneously: that some of the perpetrators' compatriots experienced unexpected kindness even as others authored suffering beyond imagination. The juxtaposition unsettles rather than excuses. As one American chaplain later reflected in his memoir, paraphrased here, "We could not undo their crimes, but maybe we could prevent ourselves from resembling them." That distinction is slender but vital, the margin separating vengeance from justice. In assessing the legacy, historians diverge. Some argue the program demonstrated moral superiority integral to democratic identity. Others caution that its success derived more from logistics than altruism, a wealthy nation's convenience disguised as virtue. The records indeed show pragmatism. Prisoner labor offset rural shortages, reducing domestic discontent. Yet within that pragmatism, human decency thrived almost accidentally. Guards routinely described unplanned conversations, shared jokes, or traded cigarettes, gestures unrecorded but enduring. Such small interactions became the fault lines through which enmity leaked away. Emotionally, the experience redefined captivity itself. For Meisner and Weber, the paradox of luxury inside confinement created a lasting disquiet. Back in flattened towns, they spoke little of it. Silence felt safer than admission that the enemy had offered mercy. But within their quiet adjustment, taking jobs, teaching children, writing cautiously about fairness, a subtler transformation worked its way through post-war German society. Historians tracing democratic resilience often list constitutional reforms or economic aid. Rarely included but equally formative was the memory carried by hundreds of thousands who had seen another version of authority, discipline unaccompanied by brutality. As decades passed, physical evidence of that chapter faded. The last of the barracks were dismantled, fields reclaimed their crops. Yet traces remained, foundations under new schools, utensils stamped U.S. Army, POW service, rings carved from tin by idle hands. Each object spoke the same paradox: captivity, nurturing comprehension. When visitors walk today through the small museums at sites like Camp Hearn or Fort Robinson, they find photographs of smiling prisoners beside American guards, ice cream in hand. Some viewers hesitate, uneasy before that comfort. Others see what one curator called a rehearsal for peace. Both readings hold. Peace, after all, is not born from perfection, but from restraint. The American POW camps were products of a time when restraint itself had nearly vanished from the globe. Their relative gentleness cannot erase the wider savagery of the war, but it demonstrates the thin yet consequential difference between defeating enemies and destroying them. Military manuals classify victory as the neutralization of threat. Ethics suggests another definition: the preservation of one's humanity while doing so. The continuing relevance is clear. Modern conflicts still test whether abundance breeds magnanimity or indifference. The story of German prisoners on American soil offers precedent and warning alike. It reminds policymakers and citizens that the measure of civilization surfaces not during triumph, but in the aftermath of violence, where treatment of the powerless reflects the victor's future self. As Karl Weber once mused to a student years later, paraphrased from his letters, "Dignity is easiest to grant when it no longer costs us." Tonight, the campfields are silent, only the wind moves through them. On humid evenings in Texas, crickets fill the space once marked by roll calls. If you stand there long enough, the scent of cut grass mingles with faint imagined echoes, the clatter of dishes, a soldier's laughter at the taste of soda, the ruffle of a flag neither feared nor worshipped. From that ordinary landscape rises a lasting question that outlived its fences. In the face of power, can mercy persist without purpose? And will future victors remember that even generosity, too, requires discipline? The answer remains unspoken, written instead in the gentle rhythm of fields reclaimed by silence and in the lingering sweetness once found behind the wire.